welcome Shaun Hollamby, star for British Touring Cars. Thank you very much for coming on the show and getting involved. But yeah, how are you?
Good, thank you. Good, thank you. I think star might be slightly exaggerated, but what am I? I suppose I'm a well-known member of the British touring car community, I suppose, is probably a better description. But yeah, no, good. Thanks, Louis. Yeah. I love your backdrop, by the way. Very impressive. The best I've seen so far on the multiple Zoom calls I've been on.
Thank you very much. Well, we've obviously got British Touring Cars back very soon, but I was going to start by asking you, when did you first become a fan of motorsport?
Well, so as is probably in a lot of people's cases, my dad was into motorsport. My mum's definitely not into motorsport, but my dad was. So he started pretty late in life with single seaters, but before that he did motocross with a sidecar, which I've got a picture of him in his mate Mick House on a bike in, I think it's about 1960, I think. So it's 5 years before I was alive and a lot of years before you were alive. Then he started in Formula V, which was probably linked to the family business, which was Volkswagen, which predominantly did Volkswagen engine reconditioning and selling spares after a period of time and working on cars in the workshop, because my dad was a mechanic by trade. And then he sort of built up a business from there. But then he did Super V, and then he moved on to Super V, so Formula V was a little bit like the Volkswagen equivalent of Formula Ford in the day, and Formula Super V was like Formula 3, but with a Volkswagen slant to it. So it had a Volkswagen engine and a Volkswagen brakes, slightly different gearbox, it had different diff and things like that. But it was a similar sort of thing, and it used to support Formula One races. So he used, it was a support slightly different than it is now, where it's all very regimented and organised. Some races had Formula 3, some races in Europe had Super V, because that was the bigger formula in Europe. So we used to go to the Nürburgring and Zolder and Hockenheim and all sorts of places all around, lots of Flughafen and all sorts of places they used to go to. But that's as a kid. But then he sort of stopped fairly. I mean, he stopped in 1980 was his last year, but I started karting at 13, where in 1979, so a long time ago, which I absolutely loved. And then he stopped racing, and he was always one of these people. He sort of had a love-hate relationship with motorsport. I probably have got similar, but probably a little more of the love for it than he had, to be honest. Because if he wasn't really doing it himself, he probably wasn't as interested in it as if he was actually competing. But he did always say to me, and unfortunately he passed away just before I started doing touring cars. And it was I doubt I'd have actually ever done touring cars, because he would have been so anti me being involved in it that I think it would have been hard for me to battle my way through. Even at my age, your dad still has a lot of influence over your decisions. That's the thing. So at the time I was 44 or something like that. So yeah, no, he was a big influence, and he's mechanical. I'm not really mechanical, so I think he always got slightly disappointed that I wasn't as hands-on as he was. I mean, if you look on the internet, when he passed in 2009, I put a load of pictures up that his wife Leslie put together at his funeral, and lots of them had a very common theme, which was a single-seater racing car, either up on its side with an engine out, or a gearbox off, or an engine in parts with his hands delved in the middle. And I think he actually probably enjoyed that part of it more than the actual racing. But he was a very competitive person. He definitely had definitely stuck his chin out when he was racing, and quite competitive, quite bullish, but I would say quite fair with it as well. I mean, I know the few times things didn't go his way and people did things that that he wouldn't have expected, and that always disappointed him. But he was quite happy to have a good hard race with people like Keke Rosberg and Kenneth Pearson, John Nielsen, people like that, Gunter Gebhardt, Walter Lechner, who just passed away unfortunately recently. They all raced in Super V, and Super V was a massive thing in Europe. Not so big in the UK, but it was massive in Europe. He was definitely where it all came from.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you obviously mentioned you started in karting, but where did you go after that? Where did you race in after that?
So I raced in karts from when I was 13 until I was, how old was I? 1985, yeah, no, 1920. And then, so I did karting, and I always did it on a shoestring. Used to turn up in my little Volkswagen Beetle with it stuck on the roof. But before that, I used to cajole friends who were a couple of years older than me to drive us down to Tilbury. And we used to go testing and then racing. And it was always done, I've got to say, not very well, if I'm really honest. When I compare it to people we were competing against, it was me and a couple of mates who I wouldn't have been able to do it without. It was Jim Gray and Neville Sykes, Stephen Sykes, Chris Talbot Smith. They all helped. We're just mates going racing, really, which is, it doesn't really happen now, which I think is a bit of a shame, actually, because for me, one of the big things as motorsport is the people that I've met along the way who've turned out to be friends. I would say most of my friends, really, except for people I went to school with, are all motor racing people. Which, it's just because you tend to have a bit of a drive in you if you're motor racing, because it's not like going to play Sunday morning football where you just put a pair of boots on and run around the park. You've got to actually prepare beforehand and get an entry in. And I know, it was much harder then to get an entry in. You had to actually write it out and put it in an envelope, and usually I was late, so I had to drive up the arterial road in Essex to go and drop the entry off to make sure it got there in time. And so it gave myself a lot more hassle than I probably needed to. But that's a bit of me, really. I love all that side of it. So, I did karting and where did I finish? Finished sixth in the UK Kart Championships in 1985. And then did Formula V, which was, again, sort of reciprocal again. There's a lot, my dad was involved and he helped out with buying the car, but I had to sort of find the money to run it. That was my thing. That was the thing with my mum and dad. Even though she wasn't really into motorsport, the family business then, they were running that, but they were very keen that they would buy a car, but I'd have to find the budget to run it. And that's not as drastic as it sounds today when they're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds to go and do Ginetta Juniors, which I think is ridiculous, to be honest. But there we are. That's my own personal view on motorsport, that it's all become much too expensive. But then it was just literally cobbling some money together to get the entry and then get the set of tyres possibly once every blue moon, mend the car when I crashed it the week before and things like that. So we went there, but so Formula V was okay, but my dad built the engines, but he built them to the spec of what he'd been running 10 years before. And the difference with 10 years before is that the fuel was a lot higher octane rating. So we ended up actually melting pistons quite a lot. It was very fast for about a lap and a half, and then suddenly the engine go bang, and there'd be lots of smoke and oil out the back. So I got a bit bored with that, because actually I just spent most of my time taking engines out, rebuilding them and putting them back in again. Not me personally. I sort of lapped the valves in. That's about as good as I could do, really. Then after that, Formula First appeared. Now, I love Formula First. I thought it was the best idea of John Webb's. It was I suppose Formula Ford. It replaced Formula Ford in his eyes, I presume, because his idea was Formula Ford, which was great back in the sort of late 60s. It's a chance of people to get involved with motorsport, and that's what Formula First did. Half the grid had never even driven a single seat, driven a racing car before, and you ended up with, unsurprisingly, lots of young people who thought they had lots of talent and didn't, and ended up crashing a lot. So it was quite spectacular. I've got to say, I was upside down as much as I was on four wheels, to be honest. And I can never really blame anybody else except myself for it. But I loved it, and I've made lots of good friends from it. I learned a lot from it. The first ever Formula First race in '87. On pole was Ben Edwards, who
Really?
you'll only know him as a commentator, but
Yeah.
Ben was a very good racing driver and still races in Formula Ford. Actually, I saw him a couple of weeks ago. He was on pole and I was second on the grid. I think there were about 42 cars on the grid, and so it was great. And then I led the first race. Then they had a red flag, and then my drive shaft broke. As Ben's did on the first restart. But we were racing with some really good, who went on to do some really good stuff. Kelvin Burt, who's a massive talent, I think, and for whatever reason didn't get up to Formula One. He got very close, but not quite there. Chris Goodwin, who's still a good friend of mine, and we still speak each other every week or so. So there's lots of other people. Who else was there on the grid? Eugene O'Brien, he was in there as well. Scott Lakin, who went on to do Formula 3, that sort of thing. So I think he was in the second year, Scott. But yeah, great formula. So I did 2 years of that. So before I go on about Formula 1, I could do a whole podcast on Formula 1. I love it. and I'd actually loved it to be something that came back now, something similar. Maybe looking slightly prettier. But something like that, I think would be fantastic to get, people who haven't got 150 grand to spend going Ginetta racing or Formula 4. I love the Ginettas. I think they're a great car, really fantastic car. But why it costs so much to run them, I've absolutely no idea. But at the end of the day, it keeps lots of people employed, doesn't it? So I can't moan too much. But then after that, I went to do multi-sports, which was a bit like a Formula First, but with a sports car body on it, a bit like a Sports 2000. So it was open top. And I won the championship in that, surprisingly, which is great. And then I thought, well, here we go. This is it, the start of a massive career. So I went to do Slicks and Wings in Formula Forward, which was a bit like a Formula 4 2000, a bit like a Formula 4 nowadays, actually, a little bit similar, but a little bit of an odd car. Didn't always handle quite as well as it should. It took me a year to get used to it. And then once I got quick, the winter series got snowed off, and then that was it, really. And then I stopped racing because I did get to the point where I thought, well, what's the point? I'm 20, was I 25, 26, something like that. And I just thought, I'm not really going to get to where I was hoping I was going to get when I was 13, when I thought I was going to be in Formula One and be a superstar, as everybody does when they start, which is actually, if you didn't think that, then you wouldn't have all the drive and energy to go and get it all done, really. And so I just went back. I went to work for the family business. We took over another company called Big Boys Toys, which was a sort of a shoot-off from Volkswagen, because Big Boys Toys did performance bits for Volkswagen Beetles and vans, which is the old Volkswagen Beetles and vans. Yeah. So all the air-cooled vans, Beetles, all that sort of stuff. Carburetors, camshafts, coloured bits, wheels, lowering bits. And so we got into that. Amazingly, I mean, again, you think about it now, but it's still a big scene. There was a huge amount going on. And it took a couple of years, and obviously the motor racing bug was still there. And the people involved, it was quite, as is with all things, when you come in and you're new to a business area, I suppose, which what the air-cooled Volkswagen scene was very much that. We got told we had to, if you want to be involved with doing Bug Jam, which was a massive event up at Santa Pod, they had like 45,000 people there camping for days. We used to sell £50,000 worth of, that was then, so we're talking 1990, sell £50,000 worth of Volkswagen Beetle parts, engines, car pits, carburetors, exhausts, all sorts of stuff. We used to take an Arctic truck full of parts and we used to sell them, and it was, that was me and my dad and people working there. It was really busy, but they wanted us to get involved in drag racing, which it can be spectacular. Didn't really float my boat, and actually my dad being quite stubborn, which I'm turning into my dad and becoming more stubborn as I get older. He didn't like being told what to do. So when they started saying, well, you can only come to Bug Jam if you do a drag racing car, he stuck his chin out, and then we all sat down with a friend of mine, Steve Malkin, and we came up with an idea of a one-make series, a little bit maybe how Formula First was, really, which you could buy a kit of parts for £2,000 to turn your road-going Volkswagen Beetle into a racing car. And so that was a lot of parts. It wasn't a little bit. It was engine, carburetor, exhaust, seat, roll cage, dampers, all the safety equipment, suit, tyres, everything really to turn your car into a 75 horsepower fire breathing Volkswagen Beetle. And actually that it was brilliant. And I think we sold 53 or 4 kits. Yeah. And the most cars we had on the grid was 42, really? Which was supporting the British Touring Car Championship at Snetterton in '93. Yeah. We're not very successfully because they all got very excited and caused 2 red flags, dropped lots of oil on the track. And Alan Gow said, "Yeah, thanks very much, but no thanks." And we didn't get asked back. But that was the highlight. The year before, we ran an event at Brands Hatch. So we got very excited. We had Top Gear involved. Chris Goffey, who was sort of a James May sort of character, I suppose, from Top Gear in those days, who'd been there for years. He contacted me and said, "Look, I'm interested in doing something with the Beetle Cup." So he drove in one of the cars, and also we had a piece on Top Gear about it, which was brilliant. You know, we got so much publicity. I mean, the press office at Brands said it's the most publicised motorsport series we've ever seen. Yeah. And that a lot of that was to do with my friend Steve Malkin, who I still know. We raced karts together at Tilbury. I remember the first meeting we had with the scrutineers about the championship. You have to go into scrutineers and get rules. And they sent it all back. It was Shaun Hollamby from Big Boys Toys and a PR man. And that's it. They couldn't remember his name. They just called him a PR man, which I still take the mickey out of him. So we did all that, but we ran this event called the Bug Prix, which was at Brands, and we had Formula V there and car displays and all sorts of stuff. But it was a massive financial disaster. I think we lost about £80,000 that weekend. It was July the 4th and 5th, 1992. I remember quite clearly. Or was it 3rd and 4th? One of the two. Anyway, I know it was July the 4th because American Independence Day. But it poured with rain. We had people camping who had hypothermia. It was horrendous. So we ended up as a complete financial disaster. Not helped by Nicola Falston from Brands, who 2 or 3 weeks just before the event put a massive surcharge of 20 grand onto the event for us to run it, so he could either cancel it or we had to pay this money. But that's why she's a very successful businesswoman and I'm not. So it's quite interesting. You learn a lot. And I think that you'll, and again, as your life goes on, but also with people, I found you learn actually a lot more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, which is quite handy for me because I've probably had a lot more mistakes than successes. So I should be doing it better by now. But yeah, so that was that. And we did that for about 5 or 6 years. And then I raced in a couple of races and my dad had a couple of goes at it. And not seriously, just to fill in. But we had loads of celebs and TV personalities and all sorts of things, people off soap operas and TV presenters. And it was great. You know, I loved doing it. And then I still had the bug for racing, but then I was having kids. So I've got 2 girls, Josie, who's about 26, I think, she's just had a baby of her own, who's 7 now. It's Brody, and then Lottie, who's 21, 22, and she again. I shouldn't be as vague about their ages as I am, but they're sort of just about to change ages, so that's fine. There is a word for that. And it's not being not a very good father. But it's so that was all going on as well. So sort of family was going on, and then 97, things slightly changed. So I was still working at Volkswagen, and I was running the workshop then, rather than Big Boys Toys side of the business, and I was quite enjoying that. It was something different for me, which is at Sydenham in South London. It's still there, not as Volkswagen, but as something else now. And then Chris Goodwin, who's, again, I mentioned earlier on, Chris, who I raced with in Formula First, we were still good friends, and his wife Sam and my wife Corinne at the time were good friends, and we were, we both had kids of a similar age, and so we're still good mates. And he started working and he's had his own career, which went stellar and did Le Mans and all sorts of stuff, and also did touring cars actually in 93, something like that, in a Vauxhall RML Vauxhall run by Speed, I think, Speed, something like that. Anyway, so, but he got me involved with Formula One management, and that was the time when F1 digital TV was just starting up. He'd been doing pit lane interviewing in 1996, and he couldn't do it in 97 because he was doing some racing. So they got me involved to do it. I started off as it's fantastic. I couldn't believe it. The guy phoned me up, Mladen Jurgovic, who was in charge of TV production, and he was very passionate character, let's say, and I loved. I really, he was massively enthusiastic about Formula One, massively enthusiastic about getting the TV right. Not the calmest person to have in a TV production studio live on air, but actually it definitely made sure you worked hard and concentrated. Let's put it that way. There was a lot of shouting, but I started off running up and down the pit lane, spotting really for the pitch channel, because for those who don't know, it was way ahead of itself, F1 Digital, because it's similar to what Sky are doing now with the F1 coverage, because you had 6 channels. So you had a data channel, you had a pitch channel, you had a track channel, A and B. So you had the lead battle and a midfield battle. So you could switch around and see. And so the midfield battle is just trying to find those. You watch television, you go, oh, why can't we see that? It's a great battle for 15 or something. Because people say, oh, Formula One's a bit boring, except for last weekend in Baku, which was probably the most exciting Formula One race I've seen. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I love it. And that's exactly what Formula One needs. They need to stop disappearing up their own backside and have a look at that race and work out what they can get best out of it, except for punctures. But I think if they took all that aero stuff off the cars, they'd have a lot less punctures. But there we go. That's another podcast as well. Talking about Formula, and then they had that's 4 channels. Then they had a highlights channel, which was a constant replay of highlights, and then they had the super channel, which was actually a mix of all those put together. So you could press your different buttons and you'd watch. And onboard channel as well. You had onboard channels, so you had a choice of all the onboards, and you had a director who would switch them around, and you'd get to choose them all. So if you think then that was 97. That's how far advanced that was. Compared, it's more than you get nowadays, really. So it was fantastic. The only thing is, it was ahead of its time technically, but it was ahead of its time for pay-per-view, because people weren't willing to pay then. But it was like, oh, pay for television? Why do we do that? They'd only just got used to having 4 channels, really, if you think about it. It wasn't long before we only had BBC, like 3 of them out there, and then before that was only 2. But you won't remember that. Now you're used to like 560 channels that you could choose from. But it used to only be 2 when I was a kid. But anyway, so it was way ahead of its time, but it's fantastic. But a fantastic experience for me, because I didn't know anything about television except for how to turn it on. And I knew about motorsport, and suddenly I'd found something that actually, as my mum had said to me, what's the point of this motor racing? Like, what are you actually learning that's going to help you in your life? Blah, blah. And at the time when I was 18, 19, I was going, well, I couldn't really give her an answer, really, except that I enjoyed it. But now looking back, what I can say is it was a fantastic experience, a fantastic learning curve for me to, meeting people, dealing with people in different environments, people who were, quite very competitive people in motorsport. And so a motor racing paddock is full of doers. And that's for me, that's what it's all about. You may not get on with those people, but you know that they've worked hard to get there. So I find that quite interesting. But then suddenly I found a job where all those years of mucking about with racing cars, as my mum would say, suddenly became of use, because I could look at the television and go, yeah, he's looking really tired, or he's, and if you can't see it, they keep cutting off things onto something that's of no interest. You know, they still do it. I think they did it in Monaco recently when they cut to something when there was a side-by-side battle.
Yeah.
But because the TV director was used to watching tennis and used to watching football or used to watching or filming, you know, the 6 o'clock news. He wasn't used to looking what was going to happen next on a racing track, you know, and he couldn't see the oil on the track, and he couldn't see that, you know, he was struggling and he was having to miss a gear to get through. He's had third gear missing or his tyres were going. And suddenly I found I had a knowledge that was actually of value. So in quite a short period of time, which is great, I worked really hard because I absolutely loved it. You know, and there were lots of people coming into it, young people who've moved on to really good stuff, not just in motor racing, but in television terms. But they just come out of university, and they were then working for me because I ended up being senior producer and director at FOM, and also head of graphics. And again, if you think about it, I was head of graphics, but at the start of that, I literally, and it sounds embarrassing now, I couldn't really even turn a laptop on. I definitely couldn't use one. I mean, I didn't know how to do emails. I didn't know how to do, you know, you know, I had a Nokia phone. You know, there was nothing. You know, you didn't send emails like you do nowadays. It's quite interesting. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, actually, with Martin Brundle when he was inducted into the Motorsport Hall of Fame, and he said his first big break came when he sent Tom Walkinshaw a letter. So he would have been about 19, I think, 19, 20. Sent Tom Walkinshaw a letter to be in one of his BMW County Series cars in 1979. And nobody sends anybody letters anymore, do they? It's like, you know, now you can literally just text whoever you like. You've contacted me on Twitter and said, Shaun, how do you fancy doing a podcast? Great, yeah, let's have a chat. That would have been impossible then. You know, it would have been hard. You'd have had to send a letter, and then maybe it would have got past the guy's secretary or whatever. But now you can actually go direct. I think it's fantastic. You know, isn't it great? You know, you've probably, in your chosen field, you've jumped 10 years, because it would have taken 10 years for you to start into, not necessarily me, because I'm quite low down the food chain, but, you know, to get hold of some of these, you know, some of these names and put a podcast and put your own TV show together, it's quite an achievement, really. And that's technology for you. There's good sides of technology, but there's also bad side. But, you know, this is a good side of technology. So anyway, I carried on. Sorry, is it all right to carry on? Should I keep going? With
of course. Yeah.
Is that all right? Yeah. Sorry, I'm being a bit one side. Once you set me off, I'm like a Duracell bunny. You can't
no worries at all.
But so I worked there. Absolutely loved it. Fantastic. Wasn't ideal. Obviously, you've got 2 young children and you're away every other week. Luckily, it was mostly flying from Biggin Hill, and I wasn't far from there in Chelsfield, so that was just around the corner. But I absolutely loved it, and I wouldn't have swapped it for the world. You know, and at the same time, I was working at Volks Bears as well, so I was using that as my holidays to have when I was freelance for them. But then I went full time in '99, something like that. And left the family business and went back there, stayed there till 2002. One of the highlights for me was directing the last live broadcast that Murray Walker did as a commentator for ITV. So I was doing the host feed, if you like. It was the first time that FOM had done a host feed. And it happened to be Murray's last race. You know, for me, Murray Walker he's the voice of Formula One, you know, of my age. It was amazing to hear. You know, it makes sense really. But Martin Brundle's been commentating for over 25 years now, and I was that made me feel a bit old. But then, you know, and so that was a great thing, because he was a lovely guy. I always remember one good thing about Murray Walker. So back when I was doing karting. In fact, I just finished karting and I was doing Formula V. I went back to Hoddesdon, and Murray was there doing a commentary. And at the time, everybody looks back and goes, "Oh, wasn't Murray great? Wasn't this?" Murray used to get quite a lot of stick about being muddly talker and getting stuff wrong and all that. But he commentated on a kart race, which is the worst thing to commentate on because they all look the same. So, you know, there's very little, especially nowadays where people don't have helmets that actually, you know, stand out from the crowd. They all look much the same with lots of swirls and bells and whistles on. But he was brilliant as a live commentator on kart. He was fantastic. And he'd done his homework, and he was able to, like, bring the race alive. So for me, that was probably the most impressive bit of commentary I ever heard him do, really. But you know, God rest his soul, because he was a fantastic human being.
Yeah.
So then after that, I went back to, I took over part of my dad's business. So I finished the TV stuff. I was still doing a bit of freelance, as I still do now. I've just started doing a bit more with them. Now I'm not as busy in touring cars as I thought I was going to be, but I've ended up being busier than I was going to be. But we'll talk about that later. So I took over the family firm of Big Boys Toys, and so my dad was retiring, so he sold that bit to me. Didn't give it to me. He sold it to me, and he conned me a bit and said there was a lease on a unit that was going to run out in a year. As it turned out, it was 10 years. But so I ended up having to rent this thing for 10 years, as well as buying another unit that we moved into. But there we go. There we are. That's a lesson for me as well, to look a bit more closely into the paperwork. He didn't rip me off. It was just one of those things. He's a very similar character to me, doesn't look at paperwork, or was a very similar character to me. Didn't look at paperwork as closely as they should do. So then we did that. But one thing I always knew, running your own business, and everybody thinks it's fantastic, but I saw massive downsides to running your own business with my mum and dad.
Yeah.
Massive stress, you know, lots of grief, constant grief from suppliers, the bank, customers, whatever. And I remember, we've got the bank manager. It used to be different then. The bank manager used to come and visit. So they had a big overdraft. So they had to make it look like they had lots and lots of stock there. So whenever we had a set of barrels and pistons, which to make a Volkswagen Beetle engine put together, they sealed back the empty box and put it against the wall. So at the end of a month, you had you had 100 engines, but you also had 100 boxes. So it actually looked like you had lots of stock and lots of engines. So it just kept the bank manager happy, as a small example. But that's the sort of, as a small business, you're always doing things like that, you know, and I don't think that's a bad thing, really. And it keeps you on your toes, but it is hard work and it's a lot of stress. So I knew that if I was going to run my own business, which made sense for us as a family, then that I wanted to do some racing, really. So I got a VW Cup car, because again, that worked with the business of doing Volkswagen side of stuff. I did that for 4 years, something like that. Should have won it in the last year, but I got pinged for being overpower, which I still argue to this day, as we check, because we checked before every race the car on the dyno, but still got done for it. But there we go, I lost, so that means I didn't win it. But I love doing it. I love the racing. I was a little bit unsure about front wheel drive to start with, but actually it didn't seem to phase me at all. If anything, it probably suited me, because I'm slightly less talented. So you can control a slide more easily in a front wheel drive car than a rear wheel drive car. So I found, but there's a certain technique to doing that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denigrating front wheel drive touring cars at all, because there is, they're probably an easier thing to get to a certain level, but getting that last 2 or 3 tenths out of them, that's the bit where a real class driver will come through. And I definitely didn't have that last little bit. But we carried on with the family business. Then the Big Boys Toys side of it morphed into AMD, which was a company which did more modern cars. So it did Audis, BMWs, Porsches, that sort of thing, but remapping and exhaust, suspension, normal servicing work, all that sort of thing. And we merged it with Big Boys Toys. So we literally went to see the company on the Wednesday. Phil Millington from Miltech Exhaust was quite key in getting that deal together, and went to see it on the Wednesday. By Saturday, it was trading at Big Boys Toys in West Durham. So
Really?
We literally got the assets, and we had. I always remember. So I wasn't sure if it would work. 2 seconds, Angie. Wasn't sure. It's all right. Somebody was pouring water into a kettle while I'm having a chat. so the first day, I remember the Saturday. So this was the difference between the two companies. So we had Big Boys Toys, which did lots of air-cooled Beetles and vans and that sort of stuff. And then AMD, which was Audi RS4s and Porsche 911s and all sorts of other stuff. But it was good. That's what he wanted to try and move the business onto. So first Saturday, the first customer who was booked in at the old AMD came to us to have an exhaust fitted and a remap. And he came in with his almost brand new Audi RS4. And then at the same time, a guy came in with his Volkswagen Beetle who was having an exhaust fitted as well. But he had sort of rings through his nose and earrings and pink hair and tattoos everywhere. And we sort of stood there with both the customers there. But there's an interesting part to it, because I suddenly thought, I'm not sure if this really works with the two customers being together. But actually, they got on like a house on fire, the two guys, because the guy with the RS4 used to have a Volkswagen Beetle as his first car. So they were chatting away like everybody was. So anyway, we carried on doing a few, doing them both side by side. But then we sold Big Boys Toys as a company a year or so later, and then carried on with AMD, and then pushed it on from there, really. And we ran. What did we do? We did some time attack races with Miltech in their not event. They're events more than races. And then we did the Sport Max Cup, which I thought was a great series. And really, I think if it had a bit more sort of push behind it from the organising clubs, it was a bit like an old Group N, but a cheaper version of it. Yeah. We ran a Seat in that. And then the next year, I got Paul Hetherington from Mardi Gras to run the car, because we didn't have time in the workshop to be running it, but on our behalf. And I got Simon Shaw to drive the car, who'd been racing against me the year before, and he won the championship. So which is great. That's 2009. So he stepped forward a little bit there. And then we decided what we were going to do next. What was going to happen? What was it? And I spoke to all the guys at work, so I like having a chat with them in the office. And we said, well, the only thing that's of any benefit to the business, but also worthwhile putting some money into, is British touring cars, because it's the only thing with a bit of razzmatazz, a bit of commerciality to it. So we thought about it for a while. I worked out a budget, which ended up being about 25% of the total budget that we actually spent. So we were way out of our league money-wise to do that. But we thought, well, how are we going to do it? We want to do it. We could have bought a Seat, which would have been a much better thing for us to do. And I actually now wish we had done that. But we ended up buying a Super 2000 Mark V Golf from Estonia, which a friend of mine, Gary Kinchin, came with me, because I was a bit nervous about driving all the way up to Estonia with a trailer and a bag full of euros in my back pocket to give to somebody I didn't know. So I thought, well, I better bring the biggest person I know, and he's very big. So, I wouldn't want to fight him. So I thought, let's see. But actually, as is always the case, they were lovely guys and really helpful. And we loaded the car up, brought it back, and then within the week, it was sitting on the Autosport show on display, looking horrendous. Now I think about it, because it had just come back and the grill was rusty and all sorts of stuff. But we get a lot of interest. I mean, I was surprised how much interest we actually got, which probably fueled us having the enthusiasm and confidence to carry on with the whole project, really. So then over the winter, it got rebuilt by Chris Tweed, who was working for us. We ran it in-house, a big learning curve. And so we went to the first race at Thruxton. And I'll tell you, the biggest thing that was in my head was, wouldn't this be a massive disaster if this car was 5 seconds off the back of the grid? Me and the car, because you couldn't really carry on with it, could you? What could you do? Because it would be an embarrassment, and you wouldn't want to be out there. But we qualified within the grid. So I think we were 16th out of 20 in the first free practice one, which allayed my fears. It was in the wet, so it slightly hid a few issues that the Golf had, which we saw on race day when it was dry. But qualifying, I think we qualified 18th out of 20 as well. I was alongside Andy Neate in that race, so he was in a West Surrey BMW, and I was in our little Golf. So it was, it was great to be on the grid. And there was one thing I do remember on the Saturday morning. I was looking a little bit lost, really, and walking up the pit lane, and this guy came up to me and said, "Oh, Shaun, my name's Steve Buckle, and you knew your dad and used to work for Ron Grant when they were both racing in Super V. So if you need any help, give me a shout and do that." And Steve was team manager for West Surrey Racing. And so it shows you what a small world motor racing was. He was a young guy starting out motor racing, and he was then a sort of a junior helper, stroke mechanic, helping Ron Grant out, who was a friend of my dad's, racing in Super V back in the 70s. So it is a small world, and that's the thing that I love about motorsport, that there's always connections everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go, you always meet somebody who knows somebody. So that was an exciting year. Cost way too much money, learned a lot, but loved the British touring car experience, and Toker, Alan Gow, Peter Riches and Dan Mayo were super supportive right from the start. And I didn't expect that, actually. I expect them to be negative about, the whole process. Why would they want this little old Super 2000 Golf run by a team who's never raced in touring cars with a driver who's 44, but actually they were super supportive, and they were trying to get, I'm sure now that I wouldn't get a look in nowadays, because they've got a full grid and they've got lots of big teams, and things have moved on, really. But Alan Gow was building probably touring cars back into what it can be, as you can see from today. Compared to sort of the late 90s, I suppose it went through a bit of a lull in the noughties, really, and it was just coming back to life, I suppose, with the new NGTC rules just around the corner. So we went from there, and then the next year we got some good sponsorship, and then because we had some good sponsorship, I decided that I think it's best that we try and get a driver who's quick, rather than just doing it because he quite likes doing it. And so we got Tom Onslow Cole involved, and that was the start, really, of us being a sort of proper team. We went from there, and we led a race for about 100 yards, I think, and Tom scored points and did that, and then he got nicked to go to Aon and all sorts of stuff. But that was another big learning curve, really. It made sense for him at the time. I wasn't very happy at the time that we lost our star driver, but for his career, definitely the right thing to do. And Tom's a great driver, and without his input, then there's a very good chance that he could have finished all much earlier than it had done. It's like you constantly dangled a carrot. If that carrot gets taken away, you suddenly start questioning why you're doing these things. So we, that went from there, and the team sort of built up from there. But I wouldn't have said we really didn't have any big success until 2000, and I suppose 18. We saw a little bit of success with Rory with the MG. And we saw flashes of what could be done in the time before. I think the team improved a lot. We probably didn't give the best card. Well, we definitely didn't give the best card to the drivers that we had all during that period. But I think with Rory, we saw that, right, it gave us a bit of a flash of insight. We had RCIB Insurance on board with Auto Aid, and Cobra Exhaust were involved with us. We had Miltech to start with, but then Cobra as another supplier of ours. So it's a business-to-business relationship, which I think works really well. And then Rory and the MG managed to wring a few results out of it that he probably shouldn't have done. And so it gave us a little bit of enthusiasm to maybe do something else. But then also we came very close just to coming out, because we did a deal. End of 2018, we did a deal with Dan Kirby at Trade Price Cars for his company to buy the two Audis that we were running alongside the MGs that year, and we'd run them as Trade Price Cars over a period of 2 years. And then that would be the end of us in British touring cars. So that could have quite easily been the end of it. But Rachel Abbott from Cobra Exhausts sort of got all enthusiastic with an idea that I'd mentioned about maybe buying two Hondas and running those alongside. And so that sort of then spiraled into something else. And we ended up coming back into it again and running 2 Hondas. But I was very keen to make sure if we're going to put all this effort in and buy these 2 cars, we wanted to have the best drivers we possibly could.
Yeah.
And I've been helping out Jake Hill since he was in Ginetta Juniors, so we were going to have Jake on board, but there was a bit of a clash of sponsorship with one of his sponsors. We had Rory on board already because he's had such a good year with us, and I was keen on, we'd both grown together that previous year, and I thought it would be great if had been able to take advantage of the Honda FK2, which was be a brilliant chassis and has been a brilliant chassis.
Yeah.
But then I tested Sam Tordoff when he'd gone away from British touring cars. He'd had a run in the Audi, and it was really just to see if he still liked touring cars, having gone to GTs for a bit. And it was a terrible day at Snetterton. It was freezing cold, and the thing was just sliding around, so it's all a bit pointless, really. But I like Sam. He's a lovely guy, and very quick. And commercially it all works, so that's great. So we ended up having a chat. It's quite hard. His manager, Tim Sugden, who I'd known from years before when we used to do instructing together and manufacturer days, he phoned me and he says, "But I know what you mean, Shaun, but Sam had been with West Surrey Racing, he'd been with Motorbase, who hadn't? Well, I think he'd been with all the good team, Triple Eight he'd been with." And Tim said to me, but he was on the phone. I remember driving. But Shaun, why would Sam want to come? Why would he need to come to AMD? I mean, what have you actually done? And I tried to do the hard sell on him, but I was struggling a little bit because no, we aren't the West Surrey, and I had to say that. So, but in the end, he did come on board, and himself and Rory had a fantastic year. Yeah. Unfortunately, on Sam's side, curtailed because his son Arlo passed away horrendously. And that was I couldn't. I mean, horrendous, and you just couldn't. I just couldn't believe it, and it'd been such a big thing for us all the year. But anyway, so that's somebody else's story to tell. But it was a huge shame because I think there were 3 meetings left. Sam had a terrible start to the year with a couple of reliability issues and a couple of incidents on track, but he was coming back really strong because he didn't have any weight on board, and he was really coming through. Whereas Rory had done really well, but he had lots of weight on board. So he was, and Rory ended up finishing. Where did he finish? He won the independents. We won the independent teams. Rory won the Jack Sears Trophy, and we finished 3rd in the teams championship. So behind West Surrey and Team Dynamics. For me, that was the most exciting thing. And Mike Bushell, who'd been a driver for us, he'd raced for us 2 or 3 years beforehand in the Focus. I sort of got the fit. He got his driver disappeared somewhere, who knows where. But I thought he had a good engineering brain, which I knew he had anyway. So I sort of took a bit of a gamble on him becoming the engineer for Rory. And it worked fantastically well. I mean, really, I helped him in the first session with the radio. And then after that, he was on his own, and he was absolutely fine. And they worked really well. A couple of times they went off on a tangent, but they had a good idea. And we had Craig Pawley, who came from Eurotech, who'd been running the Hondas before. He was the engineer with Sam, and it works really well. And I can't say that we massively reinvented the wheel with that car. Craig came from Eurotech, and really 90% or so of the setup was from what we took over from Eurotech. But I was really proud of what the team did. So that was great. And we also ran the trade price cars alongside. Jake was in one of those cars, and he managed to get podiums, and he managed to win races, and he managed to incur the wrath of Matt Neal at Alton Park when he gave him a little helping hand. But I always think that was 50-50, because when you look back at that incident at Alton Park, which was quite well documented, Matt went in on a tight line and came out on a tight line. Well, that doesn't really work, does it? That you don't usually do that. If you go in tight, you go out wide, don't you? So he was obviously pulling back across, but there we go. It was all entertaining television. Which is again a big thing that British touring cars is all about. But yeah, no, it's been great up to that side of it, and we had and then we expected, actually, last year, we got Jake into the Honda. Rory got poached by Motorbase, who offered him a better deal, which, again, I had to say, for about 30 seconds, I argued with him and tried to convince him to stay with us. And then I suddenly went, actually, it's probably best for you to go there, because, you know, the budgets are always tight. You know, Rory works really hard with his partners and sponsors to get stuff ready. So does Jake. And for me, I like that. So that was a good opportunity for Rory to move to Motorbase. And I knew that they were building a new car then. So, you know, hopefully everything would have been all right for him. I obviously hope that it wouldn't be that all right for him, as he was a competitor. But so we had Jake in the Honda, and then Sam Osborne, who showed a lot of interest when he came to see us about doing touring cars, and sort of it was good for us to have a more experienced driver, an up and coming driver. So that was all good, and we had our second year of running the trade price cars Audis. Oh, well, I forgot the first year we have run Mark Blundell.
Mark Blundell, yeah.
Jake. That's right. Sorry, I've forgotten about that. That's right. You can butt in and stop me.
That's right.
If you think if you need to tether me, but which was the first time I met Mark. Which he contacted us the year before in 2018 and spoke to me and said, "Oh, Shaun, it's Mark Blundell." I went, "Oh, right, okay. Hello, Mark. Hi, how you doing?" So obviously for me, you know, back in the 80s when I was an up and coming racing driver, and Mark's the same age as me, but he'd, you know, 17, he was out racing Formula Ford all over the place, and then he went to Formula 4 2000, then he jumped straight to Formula 3000, then obviously Formula 1. You know, fantastic career he's had, and he's a real driven person. He's got a lot of energy in him. You can see, you meet a few people every now and again through your life, and people. Bernie Eccleston I've met, he has got a lot of energy. It's sort of like a human dynamo. You can sort of almost feel the electricity when they're talking to you or whatever. And Mark is of a similar ilk. But what I liked about Mark, so he runs MB Partners, which is a management and business to business company. So he does driver management right from Formula 1, you know, all the way through to karting. And I went to one of his sort of business to business events with drivers there, and I expected it to be not quite my sort of thing. It was up in a private bank up in London, and it was all very swish and very nice and great. And that's when we were talking about touring cars and stuff. But then I had a chat with Mark, and he was with a few of the people. And one thing he said, which actually made me go, okay, this guy isn't quite what I was expecting, because he said. Motorsport, Formula 1, it sort of lost itself. I mean, you couldn't go to the Premier League and pay some money and just bolt some boots onto your feet and off you go and play in the Premier League, could you? Whereas actually in Formula 1 now, you sort of, okay, there's a bit more to it than that. But it's quite a good analogy, really. And actually I thought, oh, okay, well, we're going to get on all right. I expected him to be the opposite of that and be, you know, just trying to get as much money in as possible. But he's a racer at heart. Which is what I like. That needs to be the primary driving force of people to be involved in it. Otherwise, they'll get very bored very quickly. Because motor racing is 95% grief and 5% exhilaration, really.
Yeah.
And that's probably an exaggeration. It's probably more like 99% grief. But the exhilaration makes up for it. But it's, you know, so that was a good working partnership, which turned into a working partnership the following year when we had sponsors on board, and then we started working with them commercially. And the big thing with me for Mark, the big thing was, as soon as we'd won those championships with Rory and Sam and Mike Bushall, driving, you know, in replacement of Sam at the end of the year, that it completely changed my focus, because we'd won some trophies now. It had taken us 9 years to win some trophies. We win the Jack Sears Trophy back in 2014 with David Newsham, which is great. Thank you, Dave. But you know, we won some trophies, and I thought that would push me on to more. But what I wanted then to do is make the team commercially viable, and the only way I could see that happening would be to link up with NB Partners, because they're very good commercially and very savvy. and you can send sponsorship proposals out all you like, but if it's Shaun Hollamby, would you like to have a meeting with Shaun Hollamby? Most CEOs go, who? That's it. Whereas actually, at least you've got a chance of actually people going, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I'll have a meeting with Mark Blundell. I'd like to do that. Let's have a chat and see what it's all about. And it's all and suddenly you've got a proper, a big figurehead there to push forward. And that was the whole idea of the exercise. And I think it worked well. We had COVID last year, and commercially it was good. And I think without COVID it would be brilliant. But obviously, there's more important things than going motor racing, and and there's been lots of people who've suffered in that time. But we were luckily able to, as AMD as a business, which carries on. And what I like about it, we ran the racing team as part of the garage, like the old garagey style, which I really liked. I love it. The guys working on the racing cars probably didn't love it, and the guys in the workshop didn't love it. They kept having tyres and cars coming in and out of the workshop, getting in their way all the time. But I really liked it. But we were going to be doing sort of a business relationship and with Pete Osborne, who was Sam's dad, which we ended up talking to Motorbase about buying 2 new Focuses because we'd had problems with the Swindon engines earlier in the year, which they were trying to get more performance out. That the engine bay in the Honda is smaller than all the other engine bays on the grid, so we suffered with engine temps. And then to keep the car reliable, the power had to come down. Basically, I'm sure Swindon would disagree with me on that. We were going to buy 2 Focuses. We ended up talking about a merger between the 2 teams, which we did. But to cut a long story short, the deal changed. I didn't want to get more financially tethered to British touring cars. I'd done my 10 years in there, so I was quite happy with that we, agreed to part on good terms. I wanted to make sure that the transition worked smoothly, and I think it has done because, they had the first meeting at Thruxton, and Jake's leading the British Touring Car Championship. We're just before the Snetterton weekend, so it'll be interesting to see how Jake gets on with maximum ballast in there. But let's see what's happening. And I'm still involved with Jake. I believe in what he can do, and so I try and help where I can to make his touring car career work and be successful. So that's exciting. But now doing the pitch BTC side of things is opened up another channel really. So involved with sort of interviewing at the circuits and putting a program together, but then also we've got the studio program as well. So that's all, it's all good fun, and doing a bit of historic racing. I did try the Euro NASCAR thing a couple of years ago, but that wasn't really for me. But the historic side of stuff is really good. Love to have a historic Formula One car, or an Audi Super Touring car, but I can't find one that's the right money at the moment. But that's a bit of me really, and doing the TV side and carrying on, and going from there really. So it all seems to be working okay, but busier than I thought I was going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been great to hear some of your stories. You've had plenty, which I've really enjoyed hearing. Just to finish off, we've got Snetterton up next. It's going to be really exciting. We had a great first round at Thruxton. So what do you think we should look out for at Snetterton?
Well, there's 2 big things. The increase in success ballast, I think, is going to have quite a big effect. And then also we've got the split qualifying. So you've got the sort of the top 10 shootout at the end of qualifying, which actually there's a bit of a technique in that. And last year we Jake was 10th. I think he only just squeaked into the top 10 because we were concentrating on really just having rear tyres up to temperature so they could use them in that top 10 shootout rather than trying to set an outright time. And that does make quite a bit of difference. So it'll be interesting. But I mean, the main thing I think is I don't think Colin's going to be as competitive maybe as he was last year, because he dominated at Snetterton last year, where, and that got him back into the championship fight. And you wouldn't have bet against him losing it at the end. So it shows you how quickly things can change in British touring cars. But I think there's lots of drivers who are looking to stake their claim to to be in the shootout at the end of the year, which it always seems to be. Don't know how Alan manages to get it like that.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it exciting. And I think you definitely could have 5 or 6 drivers in with a shout at the end of the season to win the championship.
Absolutely. Well, just to quickly finish off, final question. Who's going to be leading the Drivers' Championship after Snetterton, do you reckon? I've asked plenty of people this question, and I think it's been pretty different every time. But who do you think?
Ash Sutton, I would say, because he would have been leading it after Thruxton, but he had some car problems. He obviously got the contact with Colin at the start of race 1, and he's going to have less success ballast, so he's going to be strong. He's strong round like he's strong everywhere really, but the Infinity seems to be strong round there as well. I wouldn't, I'd be surprised if it wasn't him coming away there with a good haul of points, and he's only 10 points behind despite having 2 bad races. So he's looking very strong for the championship.
Absolutely. Well, Shaun, thank you so very much for coming on the show and having the chat. It's been great to chat with you, and of course, enjoy Snetterton, which is coming up next.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Louis, and great job. Loving your backdrop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, Ben, all the best.
Thanks very much. Cheers. See you later. Thanks. Bye.